Hey everyone, and welcome back to Unforeseen Fates. Today we're doing a deep dive into some of the most chilling and bizarre cases to emerge in recent memory, stories that show just how social media can be weaponized in a way we've never seen before. We're talking about a series of shocking crimes from 2024 and 2025 where teenagers are accused of the ultimate betrayal, parricide, and familicide. Let's get started. Our story begins in the early morning hours of February 20th, 2025, in the quiet community of Carroll County, Georgia. A frantic 911 call pierced the silence. On the line was 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, her voice trembling as she reported the unthinkable. Her mother, 41-year-old Kristen Brock, and her stepfather, 45-year-old James Brock, had been shot to death inside their home. In the background of that tragic scene was the family's youngest daughter, just 6 years old, traumatized but alive. In the aftermath, Sarah Grace played the part of the grieving daughter with chilling precision. On her TikTok account, she posted teary-eyed videos filled with trending audio, filters, and heartfelt captions. Her posts went viral, drawing tens of thousands into her supposed grief. One clip where she asked strangers to pray for her family spread like wildfire. At her parents' funeral, she stood before mourners and delivered a tearful eulogy. The crowd wept with her. Friends described her as strong, brave, and broken. To everyone watching, Sarah Grace was the face of tragedy, an innocent child forced to grow up too soon. But behind that mask of grief, investigators say, was a calculated performance. While Sarah was busy crafting her online image, detectives with the Carroll County Sheriff's Office were busy reconstructing the crime. What they found was damning. Yes, the youngest child in the home had witnessed parts of what happened, but the most damaging evidence wasn't spoken. It was stored in phones, laptops, and servers. Detectives later described it as mountains of physical and digital evidence, and together, those mountains pointed directly to Sarah Grace. Her digital footprint was impossible to ignore. Private searches, incriminating messages, and online activities that conflicted with the devastated persona she displayed in public. Every post of sorrow, every plea for sympathy, prosecutors now argue, was an act of manipulation. And then came the most bizarre turn of all. Sarah Grace didn't just grieve online. She allegedly reached out to true crime influencers, asking them to cover her parents' unsolved murder. But she wasn't asking for justice. According to those influencers, she was practically pitching her family's tragedy as content. Some said she dangled supposed intel on the case to make their channels a really big hit. Think about that. A teenager whose parents had just been killed was volunteering to become the subject of true crime shows because she allegedly thought it would help spin the narrative away from herself. For 5 months, she lived with the secret. For 5 months, she kept up the facade of the grieving child. But on July 8th, 2025, that mask collapsed. A warrant was issued for her arrest, and Sarah Grace turned herself in. Suddenly, the viral teen mourned as a victim was being marched into custody as a suspect. The charges, 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault. At her bond hearing, the courtroom was a stage of heartbreak and division. Some family members begged the judge to keep her locked up, citing danger and deceit. Others, including her biological father, pleaded for her release, insisting on her innocence. The judge sided with caution, denying bond and citing vast concerns about her being a flight risk and a potential threat to others. Sarah Grace Patrick is now awaiting trial, scheduled for January 2026, where prosecutors plan to unravel her double life before a jury. The devastated daughter in public, the cold-blooded killer in private. For the community, it remains a wound that refuses to heal. For investigators, it's a chilling reminder that sometimes the loudest cries for attention may be hiding the darkest secrets. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much of what we see online is real? Can grief be faked so well that it blinds entire communities? And what does it mean when a teenager manipulates not just friends and family, but an entire digital audience while hiding one of the most horrifying crimes imaginable? Sometimes the most shocking true crime mystery isn't the crime itself. It's the person telling the story. That's all for today's deep dive into the disturbing case of Sarah Grace Patrick. The story of her alleged actions and her digital mask serves as a stark warning about the new frontier of true crime, but our journey isn't over. Join me next time as we explore a case with an alleged motive so bizarre, it sounds like a spy movie. A teenager who killed his parents to fund an assassination plot against the President of the United States. Don't miss it. What if a murder wasn't driven by rage or greed, but by a mission? A mission so extreme, so far-fetched, that it sounds like the plot of a spy thriller. What if a teenager was willing to murder his own parents to fund an alleged assassination plot against the President of the United States? On a cold February night in 2025, the quiet community of Waukesha, Wisconsin was shaken to its core. Police were called to a modest family home after relatives grew concerned when they hadn't heard from 35-year-old Tatiana Kasap and her husband, 51-year-old Donald Mayer. What deputies found inside was horrifying. Both Tatiana and Donald were discovered dead, their bodies concealed beneath blankets, already in advanced stages of decomposition. The couple's son, 17-year-old Nikita Kasap, was nowhere to be found. Investigators quickly determined that Tatiana and Donald had been killed almost 2 weeks earlier, sometime around February 11th. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the fact that Nikita had allegedly continued living in the house with his parents' decaying bodies. Prosecutors later revealed he attempted to mask the smell by sealing off rooms with plastic wrap, lighting candles, and using air fresheners. Just hours after the bodies were discovered, police located Nikita across state lines. He was arrested during a traffic stop in Kansas, driving his stepfather's vehicle. Inside the car, officers found over $14,000 in cash, family passports, the stepfather's gun, and the family dog. It became clear that this was not a runaway teen. Something far more sinister was unfolding. As investigators dug deeper, the case took a chilling turn. The FBI joined the investigation and uncovered evidence that suggested Nikita's motives extended far beyond his family home. According to unsealed court documents, Nikita had been radicalized online. He had written a Nazi-inspired manifesto praising Adolf Hitler and outlined a violent plan to assassinate then-President Donald Trump. The manifesto described the killings of his parents as a step toward funding his escape. Investigators say Nikita planned to use their money, passports, and vehicle to flee the country and eventually return to carry out an extremist plot. FBI agents also uncovered online communications in which Nikita discussed acquiring drones, explosives, and weapons. At one point, he wrote that killing the president would bring chaos and spark a political revolution. Perhaps the most haunting detail came from Nikita himself. Authorities recovered a video in which he appeared to casually acknowledge the presence of his parents' rotting bodies, saying, "I can literally see the rotten body there." In March, prosecutors charged Nikita Kasap with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of hiding a corpse, along with theft and identity-related crimes. As federal investigators examined the assassination plot, an additional charge of witness intimidation was added after a classmate reported that Nikita had threatened her if she revealed his disturbing beliefs. In May 2025, Nikita pleaded not guilty to all charges. The court set his bond at $1 million, citing the extreme danger he posed to the community and the risk that he might attempt to flee. His state trial is moving forward. while separate federal charges for conspiracy and terrorism are still under review. For the people of Waukesha, the case has been almost impossible to comprehend. A teenager, someone expected to be finishing high school, attending prom, and planning for the future, stands accused not only of killing his parents, but of plotting a political assassination inspired by extremist ideologies. It is a story that highlights the dark power of online radicalization, where vulnerable minds can be pulled into violent belief systems, and where fantasy can quickly become a gruesome reality. The trial of Nikita Kassap is expected to be one of the most closely watched cases of 2026. The community waits for justice, but the deeper questions this case raises about extremism, family betrayal, and how hate takes root will linger long after the verdict. The shocking details of Nikita Kassap's alleged plan and the sinister world of online radicalization are a chilling reminder that sometimes the true horror lies in the motive. But what if a premeditated murder was years in the making? Join me for our next episode as we head to Fort Myers, Florida, for the story of a teenager who was reportedly upset that his parents survived his long-planned attack. On the morning of May 13th, 2024, the quiet Chandler neighborhood in Arizona, known for its tree-lined streets and close-knit community, was pierced by the wail of sirens. Residents stirred in their homes, unaware that the violence unfolding just a few blocks away would shatter their sense of security. In one seemingly ordinary suburban home, an unimaginable tragedy had occurred, one that would forever alter the lives of a family and leave the community in disbelief. Inside the house lived 19-year-old Jeremiah Estelle Blair, a young man who, by all appearances, had a bright future ahead. But as the details of the crime slowly unfolded, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. According to prosecutors, Jeremiah had been secretly harboring a dark, twisted plan for years, one that would culminate in an act so chilling it left investigators reeling. The morning began like any other until the first 911 call came in at 1:15 a.m. The caller, frantic and shaken, reported that both of Jeremiah's parents had been shot inside their home. As officers arrived on the scene, they were greeted by a horrific sight: the lifeless bodies of Jeremiah's parents, both victims of gunshot wounds. The attack was brutal and deliberate, with each parent struck at close range in a coordinated assault. Yet, in a bizarre twist, both parents survived. Jeremiah's actions, however, were not the result of a sudden eruption of anger. As detectives combed through the evidence, it became clear that the teen had carefully planned this violence over an extended period. Court documents revealed that Jeremiah had kept a gun hidden in his closet for months, taking the time to mentally prepare for the moment he would act. But perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery that he had set up a video camera in the kitchen the night before the attack, suggesting he wanted to capture the murder on tape, almost as if he were orchestrating an execution. Around 1 a.m., the carefully laid plan unfolded. His father, Brandon Blair, was the first to cross paths with his son. According to reports, Jeremiah looked his father in the eye and coldly said, "I knew this day was coming." Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. After shooting his father, Jeremiah fled upstairs to his mother, Amanda Blair. As she emerged from her bedroom, unaware of the nightmare unfolding downstairs, she too was shot. Miraculously, both parents survived the brutal attack. They were rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save their lives. But even more disturbing than the attack itself was Jeremiah's reaction after his arrest. When told that his parents had survived the ordeal, his response was not one of relief, but frustration, almost as if he was upset that his plan had failed. When police arrived at the scene, they found Jeremiah waiting for them outside in the driveway. He did not resist arrest. His demeanor was eerily calm, and his subsequent confession revealed the disturbing premeditation behind the attack. Jeremiah admitted to the crime, but his words revealed little remorse, adding a chilling layer to the already horrifying act. In the weeks that followed, a grand jury indicted Jeremiah Blair on 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. Prosecutors called the crime heinous, pointing out how rare and unsettling it is for a child to premeditate violence against their own parents. The case quickly captured national attention, with many questioning the twisted motivations behind such a cold and calculated act. Jeremiah's bond was set at $750,000, and he remains in custody awaiting trial. For those who followed the case, the questions that linger are profound and unsettling. What could drive a young man to carefully plot the murder of the very people who gave him life? How does resentment fester to such an extent that it culminates in a methodical plan to kill? This case stands apart not because of a sudden outburst of rage, but because of the disturbing coldness with which Jeremiah executed his plan. The fact that he wanted to document the crime, the years of thought he put into it, and his lack of remorse after his parents survived paint a chilling picture of someone who viewed violence not as an emotional outburst, but as an end in itself. His actions raise uncomfortable questions about the depths of human psychology and the frightening capacity for calculated violence. In the end, the case of Jeremiah Estelle Blair serves as a stark reminder of how the darkest impulses can sometimes lie dormant, festering for years until they erupt in an act of chilling violence. The calculated nature of the attack forces us to confront the unsettling truth that some acts of violence are not born from a moment of rage, but from a carefully constructed plan. In the next episode of Unforeseen Fates, we continue our journey into the world of unspeakable violence, where a teenager allegedly murdered his entire family, only to be identified by the one person he thought was dead. It's a story of survival against all odds, and a chilling reminder of how sometimes the greatest horrors are the ones that come from within our own homes. In the early morning hours of October 21st, 2024, the small, close-knit town of Fall City, Washington, just outside of Seattle, was thrown into a state of disbelief and horror. What was once a peaceful community, known for its scenic views of Lake Alice and quiet suburban charm, became the scene of one of the most tragic and chilling family murders the state had ever encountered. It all began with a series of frantic 911 calls, each one reporting gunfire coming from a house on Lake Alice Road. Law enforcement responded swiftly, but nothing could prepare them for what they would find. Inside the Humiston family home, 5 people were discovered dead. The victims were 43-year-old Mark, his wife, 42-year-old Sarah, and their 3 children, 13-year-old Benjamin, 9-year-old Joshua, and 7-year-old Catherine. Each had been shot multiple times in what authorities later described as a systematic and calculated act of violence. But amidst this unimaginable carnage, there was one survivor, 11-year-old Emma, the family's youngest daughter. She had been shot as well, but had somehow managed to survive. When questioned by investigators, Emma shared a harrowing account of the events. She told detectives that her 15-year-old brother, whom she had known and loved, had been the one to pull the trigger. Despite being wounded, Emma's quick thinking and courage saved her life. After playing dead to avoid further harm, she waited in silence until the gunfire stopped. Once the coast was clear, she crawled through a window, bleeding from her injuries, and fled to a neighbor's house. There she made the chilling revelation. Her own brother was the one who killed their entire family. The case took an even more sinister turn when police revealed that the teenage suspect, in an attempt to cover his tracks, had made a 911 call earlier that morning. He falsely claimed that his younger brother had killed the family before turning the gun on himself. But when deputies searched the house, the evidence told a completely different story. Forensic analysis confirmed that Benjamin, the boy the teen had tried to blame, could not have fired the weapon. There were no fingerprints from Benjamin on the gun, and his wounds were not self-inflicted. It was clear that the crime scene had been staged, and the teen's attempt to mislead investigators only deepened the sense of premeditation behind the murders. Prosecutors believed that the 15-year-old had meticulously planned the murders, not as a spur-of-the-moment act of rage, but as a calculated scheme to destroy his entire family. His attempt to create a false narrative of a murder-suicide was an effort to avoid suspicion, but it was ultimately his own actions that led to his downfall. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they found the teenage suspect outside the home, calmly waiting to be taken into custody. He surrendered without resistance, and soon, a community that had once known this family for their warmth, faith, and commitment to one another was left to grapple with a horrifying betrayal. The days that followed saw candlelight vigils and community memorials held in honor of the Humiston family. Friends, teachers, and neighbors mourned the loss of a family that had been so integral to the community's identity. But amid the grief, there was a growing sense of shock and disbelief. How could this happen? How could a child turn on his own family with such cold, calculated violence? The legal proceedings have only just begun. The 15-year-old suspect has been charged with 5 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder for shooting his sister. While his name has not been publicly released due to his age, prosecutors are seeking to have him tried as an adult. If convicted in adult court, he could face a sentence of 25 years to life. However, if the case remains in the juvenile system, he could be released at age 25, as the maximum penalty for a juvenile conviction is limited to that age. As the case moves forward, defense attorneys have begun suggesting that the family's strict religious beliefs, homeschooling practices, and their social isolation may have played a role in the boy's troubled state of mind. They argue that these factors may have contributed to his emotional and mental struggles, though this is yet to be determined. Prosecutors, on the other hand, point to the deliberate planning and staging of the crime scene as clear evidence of premeditation, suggesting that the teen knew exactly what he was doing when he took the lives of his parents and siblings. For Emma, the surviving sister, the emotional and psychological trauma of this event will be with her for the rest of her life. Not only did she witness the brutal deaths of her parents and siblings, but she now faces the agonizing reality that her own brother, the very person she grew up with and loved, was responsible for it all. The road to recovery will be long and painful, and it is unclear how she will process the trauma of losing her family in such a violent and shocking way. The Falls City Familicide is not just a case of murder. It's a story of shattered trust, a betrayal that goes to the very heart of what family is supposed to represent. The safety of the home, the most sacred space for many, was violated in the most horrifying of ways. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the darkness that can lie hidden in the hearts of those closest to us. It challenges us to ask difficult questions. How does a 15-year-old reach a point where family becomes the target of such violence? What went so terribly wrong in the lives of this young boy and his family? And perhaps most hauntingly, can a community ever heal from a wound as deep and as senseless as this one? This case is one that will likely stay with the residents of Falls City for years to come, as the community continues to mourn the loss of the Humiston family while trying to understand how and why such an unimaginable tragedy could occur. The story of Emma, the lone survivor, will undoubtedly continue to resonate as the investigation and legal proceedings unfold, leaving a lasting scar on all who were touched by this shocking event. The survival of the 11-year-old sister in the Washington case is both a miracle and a testament to her strength, but the shocking circumstances of how her brother was caught are just as unique. Join me as we travel to Belén, New Mexico, for the story of a teenager who, in a drunken stupor, called 911 himself to confess to the murder of his entire family. What if a killer not only confesses to their crime, but also calls the police themselves to report it? What if that person is just 16 years old and the victims are their own parents and siblings? This is a story of a shocking confession and a level of intoxication that leaves us questioning what truly happened. In the quiet desert town of Belén, New Mexico, life usually moves slowly. Families know each other, neighbors wave across fences, and the biggest headlines often come from high school sports or local festivals. The kind of place where the most scandalous gossip might involve someone's backyard barbecue. But in June 2024, this small community was rocked to its core by a crime so shocking that it felt almost impossible to believe. The story begins with a call to 911, not from a neighbor, not from a witness, but from the very person accused of carrying out the crime. On the line was 16-year-old Diego Leyva. His voice slurred, his words heavy. He was drunk, but his confession was unmistakable. He told the dispatcher that he had killed his parents and his siblings. It was a confession that left even seasoned law enforcement stunned. When officers raced to the Leyva home, they found Diego outside in the front yard. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. Instead, he stood with his hands raised in surrender, waiting for the police. There was no struggle, no chase. The teenager gave himself up quietly, as if the weight of what had happened inside the home had already crushed him. Inside, deputies uncovered a scene of devastation. 41-year-old Leonardo Leyva, his wife, 36-year-old Adriana Bencomo, and two of their children were dead. Their lives had ended in violence within the very walls meant to protect them. On the kitchen table, investigators found a firearm, the alleged murder weapon, lying in plain sight. The picture painted by the evidence was as tragic as it was chilling. The first question investigators asked was simple. Why? Why would a 16-year-old boy turn on his own family? Why would he carry out such destruction against the people who raised and loved him? But answers were not easy to come by. Diego was heavily intoxicated at the time of the murders and during his confession. Investigators noted his impaired state as a key detail, but alcohol alone couldn't explain such a horrific act. Intoxication might blur judgment, but it does not erase the deliberate act of pulling a trigger multiple times. The details of the crime showed that there was intent behind the violence, making it clear that this wasn't a mere accident or momentary loss of control. As news of the murders spread, the town of Belén was plunged into mourning. Neighbors described the Leyvas as a normal, hard-working family. Nothing in their daily lives suggested they were living in the shadow of something so dark. They were a close-knit family who had been part of the community for years, yet no one saw the signs of violence brewing beneath the surface. Vigils were held, candles lit, prayers offered. The community, desperate for answers, could only grapple with a single haunting question: what went so wrong? For prosecutors, the case is now about intent and accountability. Diego Leyva has been charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, and the legal proceedings are moving forward. The defense is expected to focus on his mental state, citing his intoxication as a key factor, and raising the possibility that he may not have fully understood his actions. But prosecutors counter that the evidence, a confession, a weapon, and the deliberate nature of the act speaks volumes. While Diego's actions have shocked the town and devastated his family, his story is not unique in the tragic sense. Cases of violence involving teenagers often involve deeper psychological issues, familial strain, or toxic environments. However, the coldness of his surrender and the chilling detail of him dialing 911 himself make this case stand out. It raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of responsibility and whether a 16-year-old in a state of intoxication can fully grasp the consequences of such a horrific act. The Leyva case stands as a grim reminder that sometimes the most shocking crimes don't begin with a mystery. They begin with a confession, a phone call that leaves behind far more questions than answers, a crime that destroys not only a family but a community's sense of safety and trust. As investigators search for a deeper motive, the town of Belén is left grappling with the aftermath of an unimaginable tragedy. In Belén, people still drive past the house where the murders took place, their eyes lingering for a moment before they turn away. For them, the case of Diego Leyva will never be just another news story. It will remain a scar, a reminder of how even in the quietest of towns, unimaginable tragedy can strike without warning. As the legal proceedings unfold, it is clear that the town's grief will continue, and the haunting question of why will likely never be fully answered. For now, the family's surviving loved ones are left to mourn and to piece together the fragmented story of what led to such a violent and tragic event. And the rest of us, watching from afar, can only wonder how something so senseless could have been avoided. The heartbreaking confession of Diego Leyva from the scene of the crime is a rare glimpse into the immediate aftermath of an unspeakable act. But how does this compare to another teenager who also confessed to his parents' murders? Join me for our final installment as we go to a church in Florida where a 14-year-old called 911 to confess, telling the dispatcher he needed to pray. What if a killer's first stop after committing the most horrific of crimes wasn't to flee, but to seek sanctuary? What if a 14-year-old boy walked into a church, not for services, but to call 911 and tell them he had just murdered his parents because he needed to pray? In the quiet suburban town of Middleburg, Florida, life usually unfolds at a slow, familiar pace. Families gather for backyard barbecues, neighbors chat across fences, and Sundays are reserved for church and rest. But in August 2025, that sense of normalcy was ripped away when an act of shocking violence unfolded inside a family home, an act carried out not by a stranger, but by a child. At the center of this story is a 14-year-old boy, reportedly identified as Trevor Lee. Authorities say that what began as a domestic argument between the teenager and his parents escalated into something far darker. In a moment investigators believe was deliberate, Trevor allegedly picked up a gun and turned it on his parents. His victims were his father, 44-year-old David Lee, and his mother, 45-year-old Brandy Smith. When deputies entered the home, they discovered both parents fatally wounded. The murder weapon had been left behind, lying at the scene, but Trevor wasn't there. For a moment, it seemed like another tragic case of a killer on the run, but the truth was far stranger. Instead of fleeing into the night, Trevor walked to a nearby church. It was here, in the sanctuary where others seek comfort and peace, that he picked up a phone and dialed 911. With a calmness that still rattles investigators, he confessed. He told the dispatcher that he had shot his parents, and then added that he needed to get somewhere to pray. That detail sent shockwaves through the community. The idea of a teenager confessing to murder from inside a church, asking not for forgiveness, not for help, but simply for a place to pray, it left even seasoned officers and pastors at a loss for words. Trevor was taken into custody without incident. Authorities say he did not resist, did not lash out. It was as though he had already resigned himself to whatever would come next. The Clay County Sheriff's Office later confirmed that a grand jury indicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder, and prosecutors announced their intention to try him as an adult. For a boy barely in his teens, this decision underscores the gravity of the crime and the weight of the charges against him. The motive behind the fatal argument remains murky. Some neighbors describe the family as quiet, with no history of public trouble. Others whispered about tensions inside the home. But what exactly was said that night, and what pushed Trevor Lee to pick up a weapon against the very people who gave him life, may never be fully understood. For the people of Middleburg, the case has left a lingering unease. It's not just the brutality of the crime, it's the way it ended. A child standing in a church, confessing calmly, asking only to pray. It forces us to question how such darkness could grow unnoticed inside an ordinary suburban home. Today, Trevor Lee awaits trial, his future to be decided in a courtroom rather than a classroom. The justice system will determine whether his age lessens his responsibility or whether the violence of his actions demands the full weight of adult punishment. For a community that once prided itself on safety and simplicity, the case of Trevor Lee is a chilling reminder. Even in the most ordinary of places, tragedy can strike, leaving behind only questions, grief, and the haunting echo of a young boy's confession. The confession made from the sanctuary of a church marks a haunting end to this story. These tragic cases reveal a disturbing trend of unimaginable violence within the family unit. They remind us that evil can sometimes come from those we least expect. Thank you for following this story. If you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell for more content exploring the darkest corners of real-life events. Until next time.